This is the Morning Swim Show for Friday, February 10th, 2012. I'm your host, Peter Bush. In the Finis Monitor today, we're talking once again with Bruce Wigo, the CEO of the International Swimming Hall of Fame. The past few days, we've been doing a series of shows to highlight a handful of the new videos in their archives. And Bruce joins us right now once again in the Finis Monitor from Fort Lauderdale. Bruce, welcome back to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Peter. Thanks for having me back.
Good to have you back. So today we're going to talk about ISHOF celebrating African history, African American history in swimming.
Yeah, this is really, to me, coming into the Hall of Fame 5 or 6 years ago, I really knew nothing about this. And going through the Hall of Fame to find out the absolutely most incredible untold story about the great tradition of swimming in Africa really blew me away. When I read in the Thibodeau book, which was published in 1697, and it was the book that Benjamin Franklin used to teach himself how to swim. When I read in the introduction that basically, this is almost an exact quote, that in the ancient days the Romans and Greeks were the great practitioners of swimming and diving, but in modern times it's the Africans and the Indians who excel all others in the arts of swimming and diving. It's to them that our ladies owe their pearls. It's to them that all the merchandise that is recovered from sea has been brought up by these people, and all the great maritime wealth of the world for hundreds of years was there. And actually the Europeans and white Americans did not really swim or take up swimming until the middle of the 1800s. And then the African Americans and the Native Americans were either relocated to places where you couldn't swim or kept out of every safe swimming hole. And when swimming pools were built to address the great issue of drowning in the white population, African Americans were excluded from swimming places. So over the last 150 years or so, we went from 80% of African Americans being swimmers and other minorities to 80% that cannot swim now, and from a point of 20% of white Americans swimming to now 80% do. So this is really one of the most incredible untold stories of cultural history in the United States. And the tragedy, of course, is that today the drowning statistics are way out of proportion for minorities.
And in the video we're about to see, you interview Lee Pitts.
Yeah, Lee Pitts is really a pioneer in swim instruction. He's maybe today the only African American that has a swim instructional video for teaching kids to swim. He was a lifeguard and a swimmer growing up in the South, and really didn't have a lot of opportunities, and that's why he did this. He was a banker, and now he has a TV show down in the west side of Florida, and he's won a lot of Black Emmy Awards for his shows. He's really been very positive and outspoken on the need to get more black kids swimming, and that the stereotype that blacks can't swim is absolutely ridiculous, not only because it's not true, but historically the exact reverse was true.
All right, let's take a look.
February is Black History Month, and International Swimming Hall of Fame CEO Bruce Wigo invited NAACP Image Award-winning swim instructor Lee Pitts to speak about the history of African Americans in swimming. Lee Pitts is a nationally and internationally known swim instructor who has appeared on TV programs throughout the world promoting the benefits and joys of swimming. Mr. Pitts also has a best-selling Learn to Swim video program, which is the only one produced and starring an African American swim instructor.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you know?
Yeah, Bruce, I'll be glad to, and I think a lot of the viewers will be surprised to know that all the way back to the days of slavery, there were some great African swimmers. You take B.R. Brent in his memoirs in 1740, he talked about the times when he and his friends, his 13 friends, were engaged in a wonderful activity of swimming. And then they were captured and put onto a slave ship. One minute they were engaged in a beautiful sport of swimming, enjoying themselves, and then they were captured, shackled, and put on a slave ship. So here they are now at the hull of a slave ship, shackled and bound after enjoying the beautiful sport of swimming. And those were some of the great swimmers in West Africa. It's been well documented that in 1679, there was a surviving slave from a shipwreck that took place. This slave swam 60 hours nonstop to the shores where he was rescued. And then there was our good friend York.
Who was York?
York was part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Many of us are familiar with that from our history books. He was the only slave who was a part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was a childhood friend of Clark. He was also Clark's slave, and he was the strongest swimmer on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Took on most of the bulk of the swimming requirements at that time to make that expedition successful. And then there was Tice Davis. Now, Tice Davis is very interesting because we mostly identified the Underground Railroad, the term the Underground Railroad, with Harriet Tubman. Tice Davis, who was a slave from the West Indian origin, he swam the Ohio River. Now, as his slave master was chasing him on a boat across the Ohio River, Davis disappeared. And the slave master, thinking that Davis had died, he said, "Hey, this guy must have taken the Underground Railroad." And that's where that term, the Underground Railroad, came from. Well, of course, Davis was able to make that swimming to safety. For example, Duke Kahanamoku, right here, was a great swimmer. In fact, he was an Olympic champion in 1912 and 1920, a dark-skinned Hawaiian. He did a lot of exhibits around the country, but he was never allowed to swim in the South.
We're standing here at the site of the original casino pool, which was built in 1928 and is what made Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the world capital of swimming. This pool was built in 1928. All the great swimmers of the time, from the late 20s up through till it was demolished in 1965, came here. And it was this tradition of swimming which led to the establishment of the International Swimming Hall of Fame here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. But, Lee, there was an underside to the world capital of swimming in that era. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, you talked about a very sterling history of this International Swimming Hall of Fame in the swimming pool. But what is less well known to a lot of people is that at that time, particularly up until 1965, from the building of the pool in 1928, no African Americans were allowed to swim in this swimming pool. So that's a big black spot or dark spot in the history of swimming here in Fort Lauderdale. Here we are, Bruce, on the magnificent Fort Lauderdale beach, world-renowned beach. But prior to the passing of the desegregation bill in the 1960s, African Americans couldn't swim on this beach. In fact, African Americans had a difficult time getting opportunities to swim in the whole beach setting. It was very hot. We're here just imagine here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, any part of Florida for that matter, where in the drenching 90-degree weather, you couldn't go to the beach. So what they did to accommodate African Americans, they created another beach that was called the Black Beach. Very difficult to get to because you had to take a ferry to the beach. You had to go through the whole logistics of that. And then when you got to the beach, you really felt isolated. And of course, it didn't have all the finer amenities of a beach like this. And but this beach became a very, very important part of the integration of swimming pools and integration of other facilities in the area. A lot of our people are familiar with the fact that during the civil rights movement, African Americans and whites as well used restaurants, hotels, and things of that like to do what was called sit-ins. This was to dramatize the fact that African Americans who were American citizens could not use restaurants and hotels and things of that nature in America. So another thing that dramatized that was the use of water, pools, and beaches. Those were called wade-in, a la sit-ins, wade-in. And so they would come here and get into the water and dramatize the fact that they couldn't get in the water. And then, of course, when the police came in and made it more of a public appearance, and the fact that they couldn't, photographs were taken, that moved the civil rights movement along. And it was a very, very, very big deal back then to see an African American or people of African descent actually swimming, very few clothes on, in water, intermingling with white people at the time. So the swimming pools, the beaches, particularly like in areas like here in Fort Lauderdale, that is, did a great job in moving forward the progress of blacks in America.
We're here at the International Swimming Hall of Fame Aquatic Complex in February of 2007 at a United States swimming swim meet. And Lee, you've made some interesting observations about what's taking place behind us.
Yes, Bruce, the observation is pretty factual. That here it is in 2007. The world has changed a lot, but it hasn't changed in terms of swimming. You still see right here where you have very few African Americans participating in the swim meet. In fact, in U.S. swimming, that's less than 1% of African Americans who are registered in U.S. swimming. And that's a tragedy in itself, because when you go back in history, before slavery, Africans who were on the west coast of Africa arguably were some of the greatest swimmers of all time. And still, we don't see more African Americans participating here in one of the wonderful sports of swimming. Forget about all the myths and all the problems. Think about this. The history that we just explored of Africans and African-American swimmers is a very exciting and rich history. If you want to know more about that history, just download it. Black Splash, the history of African-American swimmers.
And Bruce, now bringing it full circle to today when we're seeing more African Americans not only learning to swim, but excelling even on a national and international level.
You know, but still, when you go to the nationals, Peter, you can count on one hand the number of African Americans that are there. You know, you see some great ones: Colin Jones, you know, Maritza, Anthony Irvin. But you know, you tell me. I've been, you know, the Y Nationals or Nationals. I've gone out to these things and counted them, and you got a handful.
Yeah.
You know, certainly less than 1% are there, and it's, you know, when you look at the dominance in other sports, it's ridiculous.
Well, you're right. Well, I think USA Swimming would be smart to definitely focus a lot of resources in getting some of those great athletes in the pool.
Yeah. Well, I think that really education is that, you know, the perception in the, you know, in both black and white communities are that, you know, well, I think the problem is that people look at swimming as a sport. And if you're, you know, you see it on TV, what sport are you going to go into? You know, you got one Michael Phelps, but you got, you know, hundreds of basketball and football players that are making millions of dollars. And I think the mistake that we do is to try and pitch swimming as a sport rather than a life skill that can save your life and give you access to, you know, the world of recreational activities that swimming gives you. But once kids get in and you motivate the parents to take them to swim lessons, if a kid's good, he's going to go along and he's going to like it. So we're going to get the numbers that way. But to try and sell it as a sport, I think is a big mistake, at least initially. That's you know, I think we got to tell them that, you know, look, it wasn't a sport back in those days, but, you know, black people owned the water. They were in the water all the time. They were constantly, you know, when you look at the history of Africa, and you see these guys, and explorer after explorer, marveling that African kids were brought up from the time they could walk as swimmers, and their skills were so outstanding. And this has to go back centuries, not just the time that white explorers reached the sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, this is every bit as much a part of African tradition as it is anybody's tradition, but why aren't they swimming?
Well, Bruce, thank you very much again for joining us and giving us some great perspective. Appreciate it. All right, that's Bruce Wigo joining us in the Phoenix Monitor today. That's it for today's show. I'm Peter Bush, reminding you to keep your head down at the finish.